Welcome to Silent Terror, where the shadows whisper and fear has a voice. Before we begin, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and lock the door behind you. What you're about to hear are true nightmares hidden behind school walls, places you thought were safe. But remember, in these stories, the lesson is simple. Not all classrooms are meant to be left. Let's begin the horror. It was the final week of rehearsals for Crestwood High's annual fall play, and this year, the drama club had chosen a particularly eerie script. The play, titled The Wraiths of Evermore, was a gothic horror story about a haunted mansion, filled with ghostly apparitions and cursed souls. But there was something about this year's production that felt different. The script had appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't the usual script the club used. No one knew who had written it, but it had been handed to the club's president, Clara, during their first rehearsal. It was a thick, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and stained, and its contents strange. The characters' names and scenes shifted on their own, the dialogue changing with each new reading. Clara had dismissed it at first, thinking it was just some weird coincidence, but as rehearsals went on, things started to get weirder. The actors began acting differently, not just in character, but in their behavior. They were forgetting lines, speaking in voices that weren't their own, and moving with an unnatural grace, as if the script had a power over them. Maggie, a senior who had been in every school play for the past 4 years, was the first to notice it. During one rehearsal, she saw Clara sitting at the back of the auditorium, staring intently at the script. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Clara?" Maggie called out, walking over to her. "Are you okay?" Clara didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Maggie waved her hand in front of Clara's face. "Clara? What's wrong?" Finally, Clara blinked. She turned to Maggie, but her smile was off, too wide, too stretched. "Oh, I'm fine," Clara said, her voice eerily calm. "I was just reading ahead in the script. The ending is unsettling." Maggie didn't know why, but she felt a chill run down her spine. The whole situation felt wrong, like something was not just off with Clara, but with the entire play. That night, after the rehearsal, Maggie stayed behind to look at the script herself. She wanted to know what had happened to Clara, why the play was so different this year. She opened the leather-bound book, the pages creaking as she turned them. As she scanned the text, something caught her eye. One of the scenes was written differently than before. The ghostly character that had been scripted to disappear was now lingering on stage, moving closer to the protagonist. But it wasn't just that. The words themselves seemed to shift, changing before her eyes, as if the script were alive, evolving in real time. The room grew colder, and Maggie's breath came out in visible puffs. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Suddenly the lights flickered, plunging the auditorium into darkness. Maggie froze, the script clutched tightly in her hands. A low sound echoed through the room, a distant, echoing laugh. It wasn't one of the actors. It was something else. Then, from the shadows, a figure appeared. Maggie gasped, dropping the script. It was one of the actors, Jeremy, who played the villain. But his face was different. His eyes dark and hollow, his skin pale as death. His movements were unnatural, jerky, as though he was being controlled by something otherworldly. "Jeremy," Maggie whispered, stepping back. "What happened to you?" But Jeremy didn't respond. Instead, he stepped toward her, his smile twisted and unnerving. "The play is just beginning, Maggie," he said, his voice low and hollow. "And you are part of the cast now." Maggie screamed. but no sound came out. She turned to flee, but the doors to the auditorium slammed shut, trapping her inside. The lights flickered again, and the room began to shift. The stage was no longer just a set. It had become the very house from the play. The walls began to close in, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Maggie's heart raced as she realized the truth. The play wasn't a play anymore. It was real. The characters, the house, the ghosts. It was all real, and she was part of it now. As the ghostly figure of the wraith appeared at the center of the stage, her hollow eyes locked onto Maggie's. The creature's skeletal fingers reached toward her, the smile on its face stretching unnaturally wide. "We are all part of the script now," the wraith whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. "You, the actors, the audience, all of you." Maggie tried to run, but her body moved as if it were no longer hers to control. She reached the edge of the stage, only to find the entire auditorium had turned into a maze of dark, twisting corridors. Every hallway was a dead end. Every door was locked. She was trapped, like the rest of the cast and crew before her. One by one, the other actors began to appear, their faces contorted into twisted expressions. Clara was there, but she wasn't the same. She was dressed in the costume of the ghost, her eyes wide and unblinking. The others, too, had become part of the play, lost souls trapped in a cycle of rehearsals, bound to the script forever. The wraith's voice echoed in Maggie's mind, speaking words that she couldn't escape. "Once the play begins, it never ends," the wraith whispered. "You will perform, again and again, trapped in this cycle. You are now a character, a part of the story, and it will never let you go." As Maggie struggled against the pull of the wraith's voice, she could feel her very essence slipping away. She was no longer Maggie. She was an actor, a character in a script that had no end. And then the lights flickered one last time. The audience filled the seats, the curtain rose, and the play began. It was supposed to be a typical Friday afternoon at Crestwood High, but for a small group of students, their world would never be the same after they were sent to detention. The bell had just rung, signaling the end of the school day, but instead of heading home, 5 students found themselves reluctantly making their way to room 108 for their punishment. There was Dylan, the class clown, who had been caught skipping class; Grace, the quiet, studious type, who had been accused of cheating on a test; John, the jock, who had broken into the teacher's lounge and eaten all the leftover pizza; Sarah, the rebellious teen who had been caught smoking behind the school; and lastly, Jake, the newcomer, who had barely been at the school for a week, but already found himself in trouble for insulting a teacher. None of them were particularly thrilled about spending 2 hours in the stuffy, windowless room, but they had no choice. The door to room 108 closed behind them with a loud clang, and they were locked in. "Guess we're stuck here," Dylan said, throwing himself into a chair with a dramatic sigh. The room was exactly what you would expect. Rows of desks, a chalkboard at the front, a few posters on the wall advertising upcoming school events. But there was something about it that felt off. Jake couldn't put his finger on it. The air seemed too still, too thick. He scanned the room nervously. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows along the walls. "Does anyone else think it's a little weird that we're the only ones in here?" Jake asked. "I don't know," Sarah muttered, pulling out her phone and glancing at the screen. "It's just detention. What's the worst that could happen?" Grace, who had been sitting in the corner, stared blankly at the desk in front of her. "I don't feel right," she whispered, almost as if to herself. "Stop being so paranoid, Grace," John said with a smirk. "It's just detention. Nothing's gonna happen." But that was when the first thing happened. The door to room 108 creaked open. At first, the students thought it was just a teacher coming to check on them, but when they looked up, they saw nothing. The hallway outside was empty. No one was there. The door had just opened on its own. A chill ran down Jake's spine. He stood up and walked over to the door, peering out. But there was no one in sight. No teachers, no students. It was eerily quiet. He slowly shut the door, but as he did, a sound echoed from the back of the room, a slow, deliberate scraping sound. "What the hell was that?" Dylan asked, standing up from his chair. They all turned to face the back of the room, where a large metal cabinet stood. It was the only piece of furniture in the room that looked out of place, old, rusted, and oddly ominous. Another scraping sound followed, then a low, rattling noise. "Is something in there?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. John walked over to the cabinet, shaking his head. "It's probably just some rats or something," he said, trying to sound dismissive. He grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. Nothing, just empty shelves and a lot of dust. But as John stepped back, the door slammed shut on its own. Dylan laughed nervously. "Okay, that's freaky. It's probably just an old cabinet, nothing to worry about." But the strange feeling in the room didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. Suddenly, the clock on the wall began to tick loudly. Too loudly. It sounded like a hammer pounding in their ears. The minute hand was moving too fast, too erratically, as if time itself was warping. Then came the whispers. At first, they were barely audible, low, distorted murmurs. But as they grew louder, the students' eyes widened in terror. The whispers seemed to be coming from all directions. "Who's there?" Grace whispered, her voice cracking. No one answered. The room began to shift. The walls seemed to warp and stretch, and the floor felt like it was tilting. The fluorescent lights flickered again, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own. Dylan's breath caught in his throat as the room around them began to distort. The desks were no longer lined up neatly. They were scattered haphazardly, as if they were being thrown by an invisible force. The once normal room now resembled something from a nightmare, warped, distorted, and alien. "Something's wrong," Jake said, his voice rising with panic. "We need to get out of here." But when they tried the door, it wouldn't budge. John slammed his shoulder into the door, but it wouldn't open. It was like the room itself was keeping them in. The more they struggled, the worse it got. The whispers turned into hissing voices, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch, reaching toward them. "No!" Grace screamed. "We can't stay in here! We have to get out!" But it was too late. One by one, the students started disappearing. It started with Dylan. His body flickered, his form distorting like a bad TV signal, and then he was gone, vanished into thin air. "Dylan!" Sarah cried, her voice shaking. "Where'd he go?" Then John, followed by Sarah and finally Grace. Each of them was swallowed by the dark, twisted space that had once been a simple detention room. Jake was the last one left. His heart pounded as he desperately looked around, his mind racing. He had to escape. He had to get out. But before he could move, the voice came again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered. The walls began to close in on him. His breath quickened, his chest tightening. The shadows were all around him now, consuming everything. There was no escape. And then, just as the darkness overtook him, he heard it, the sound of a door creaking open. He wasn't sure whether it was real or just in his head, but in that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness take him. When Jake opened his eyes again, he was back in the real world. The clock on the wall of room 108 ticked normally again, and the desks were back in their original places. The room was as it had been when they first entered. But the students, they were gone. No one would ever remember them. They had disappeared, their names erased from existence. The school would go on as if they had never been there. But Jake remembered, and as he walked out of the room, he could still hear the whispers, faintly echoing in his mind. It was supposed to be a normal day at Riverbrook High, just like any other. But for a group of students in Ms. Carter's history class, everything changed when they stumbled upon a strange, old map hidden beneath the floorboards in the school library. The map was tucked inside a leather-bound book, its edges frayed and pages yellowed with age. Mia, the curious and adventurous student, had found it while exploring the library's hidden corners. The map depicted the layout of Riverbrook High, but there was one detail that immediately stood out: an additional floor labeled only as 13. No one knew anything about a 13th floor. The school had been built decades ago, and the floors were numbered up to 12. As far as everyone knew, there was no 13th floor. Ms. Carter, the history teacher who had been with the school for over 20 years, had never heard of it either. After class, Mia showed the map to her friends, Ryan, Olivia, and Mark. They were all intrigued, but hesitant. "It's probably just an old part of the building that was never finished," Ryan said, unsure. But Mia had already decided. She would find it. They began their search in the halls after school, sneaking past janitors and teachers. The map led them to an old service elevator at the far end of the school's east wing, hidden behind a set of unused lockers. The elevator was old and rusty, its brass buttons tarnished and covered in a thick layer of dust. "This is it," Mia said, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. "This has to be it." Without a second thought, she pressed the button for the 13th floor. The elevator groaned to life, its ancient gears creaking as it began to rise. The others exchanged uneasy glances, but the excitement was too much to ignore. As the elevator climbed higher, a strange sensation filled the air, like the temperature dropped several degrees and the world outside seemed to grow quieter, as if they were leaving the real world behind. The elevator doors opened with a soft hiss. The air smelled stale, like it had been undisturbed for years. But when they stepped out, they found themselves in a hallway they had never seen before. The walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper, the faint outlines of long-forgotten paintings hanging crookedly. The floor was covered in dust, and the silence was deafening. It was as if no one had walked through this part of the school in decades. "What is this place?" Olivia whispered, her voice barely a murmur. Mia led the way, her flashlight illuminating the dark hall. The map in her hands seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. She glanced at it and followed the directions, heading down the corridor until they reached a door that appeared out of place. It was made of thick black wood, with iron hinges that seemed to glimmer in the dim light. "I think this is it," Mia said, her heart racing. She reached for the door handle and turned it. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed down the empty hall. Inside, they found a room frozen in time. It looked like an old classroom, but the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the chalkboard was covered in strange symbols and markings. There were no windows, no signs of life, just a hollow, suffocating silence. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. "Who did that?" Mark shouted, spinning around, but no one had touched the door. Before they could react, the lights flickered, and an eerie sound filled the room, like whispers, low and indistinct. The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching across the walls like reaching fingers. Mia felt her breath catch in her throat. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She turned to the others, but they weren't the same. Their eyes were hollow, their faces pale. Their bodies seemed out of sync, as if they weren't fully there. "Mia," Ryan whispered, his voice slow and distorted. "We shouldn't have come." The walls around them began to close in. The symbols on the chalkboard twisted, shifting like a living thing. Mia tried to move, but her feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were inside her mind. Suddenly, the room was no longer the same. The walls turned to black stone, the floor to cracked marble. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence. From the shadows emerged something, an ancient, towering figure, its face obscured by darkness. Its voice came as a whisper, yet it was as clear as if it was right next to her. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice like the sound of rustling leaves. "You have disturbed what was meant to stay forgotten." The figure reached out, its shadowy hands stretching across the room. Mia screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. One by one, the others began to fade, their bodies flickering like broken film. Mia tried to run, but the darkness grabbed her, pulling her down into a void, a place where time had no meaning, where the 13th floor was neither past nor present. It was something in between. When she awoke, she was back in the hallway, standing alone in the dark. The door to the 13th floor was gone, and the elevator had vanished as well. The school seemed unchanged, but Mia knew better. The 13th floor had never really been part of the school. It had been a place for lost souls, for those who stumbled where they should not have. And no one would ever remember it, because no one was meant to. The students of St. Andrew's High School had always heard the rumors about the janitor's closet. It was a place that no one dared to venture. Its door, locked tight with chains for as long as anyone could remember, sat at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. But there were always those students who, no matter the stories or warnings, wanted to test the limits. And it was on a dreary Friday afternoon that 4 friends, Ryan, Tasha, Eric, and Jenna, decided to confront their school's darkest secret. They had been daring each other all afternoon, their usual games of pranks and tricks growing increasingly reckless. But when Ryan brought up the janitor's closet, everyone grew silent. It had been years since anyone had even looked at it. "Let's go in," Ryan dared, a challenge glinting in his eyes. "I'll go first." The others hesitated, the atmosphere thick with nervous energy, but curiosity won out. The janitor's closet had always seemed foreboding, a dark wooden door tucked away in a forgotten corner of the school. There was something about it, something wrong. Every student knew it was forbidden. The school had a rule, but no one could explain why. In fact, none of the teachers or staff could remember exactly why the closet was locked. All anyone knew was that it had been locked for decades. When Ryan approached the door, it was unnervingly easy to open, as though the lock had long since rusted away. The others followed him inside, their steps hesitant, but eager to prove their bravery. It was dim inside, the faint scent of cleaning supplies and mildew hanging in the air. Ryan flicked on his flashlight, illuminating rows of old brooms, mops, and cleaning equipment. Nothing unusual. But then Ryan stopped. "Hey, what's this?" he muttered, crouching in front of a large wooden box shoved at the back of the closet. It was old, far older than anything the janitor would have used. Covered in dust, it had strange carvings on its sides, something that looked like faces in agony. Tasha's eyes widened as she stepped closer. "That's weird," she whispered. Is that blood?" Ryan reached for the box, but as his fingers touched it, the ground beneath them trembled and the air grew cold. The flashlight flickered, and a low hum filled the room. Jenna screamed as the box suddenly shifted, opening with a long, groaning sound. Inside the box there was nothing, except for a dark, swirling hole. Ryan leaned forward, his curiosity getting the better of him, and peered inside. The hole was not just dark, it was endless. No light, no bottom, just a vast, yawning emptiness. "I don't think we should be here," Tasha said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave, now." But it was too late. Ryan was the first to fall. His body dropped like it was being pulled by invisible hands. One second he was standing next to them, the next he was gone, vanished into the blackness. "Ryan?" Eric called, panic rising in his voice. Jenna took a step back, horror twisting her features. "We need to get out, now!" But as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Tasha screamed, her voice echoing through the narrow space. The walls seemed to close in around them. The air grew heavier, thicker, suffocating them. As they tried to open the door, the sound of dragging footsteps filled the air, followed by a low, guttural growl. Something was coming. Something was alive within the closet, feeding on their fear. Suddenly, the walls shifted. The closet grew larger, impossibly so. The small storage room they had entered was now a labyrinth, twisting and stretching like a maze that had no end. Eric's face paled as he realized the truth. "We're not in the school anymore." One by one, they began to disappear, lost in the shifting darkness, their screams fading into the void. The school would never speak of them again, as though they never existed. But for those brave enough to wander the halls after hours, there were whispers. Whispers of a hidden door in the janitor's closet, and the students who had gone missing, their memories erased from the minds of everyone who had known them.